So, good morning, everyone. Bonjour, Anin, Bojo, Sego Sewa Grego. Welcome to day 2 of the Diversity Institute's 2-day virtual conference on online hate, media misrepresentation, and systemic racism. If you attended yesterday's sessions, welcome back. And if you're joining us for the first time today, we're really glad that you're able to attend this, at least this second day of this very exciting conference. My name is Juan Marciai, and I'm the Director of Research Special Projects for the Diversity Institute, and I will be your MC for today. But before we begin, I just wish to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples whose presence really continue to enrich our communities. As we're not all gathered in the same space, given the breadth of our audience, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. And so we ask that if that's the case, that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders of those territories. Now, Toronto, where the Toronto Metropolitan University is located, is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. Now, the Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory they're on and to protect that land. So subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Now, as a number of Indigenous colleagues and friends have also generously shared with me, it's also a responsibility to always give thanks. And so beyond an acknowledgement of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples, I'd also like to express some words of gratitude for coming together today again on the second day of the conference on this land that we stand on. Even though we're doing so virtually, I think we're still connected by that land. And by giving thanks to the land, I'd also like to reflect on some of the reminders that land and nature and the natural world give us. That reminders, for example, that we are our relations. And by we here, I mean all of us, all living beings in nature. And by focusing on those relations, we really are reminded that it's by working together across our differences and in our complementarities as well, because that's in part what the differences are. It's working together across them that we grow stronger. Mother Nature teaches us that, just to give one example, with the example of the 3 sisters, corn, bean, and squash, and how they grow together so well, protecting, nurturing each other, always in collaboration and reciprocity with each other. These lessons and these teachings are really all around us, made available to us so generously by the land. And I think we just have to listen. We have to listen and pay attention. Now, I'd like to take also the opportunity to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for their support as this conference is partly funded by a Connection grant. Now, this conference focuses on 2 themes. Yesterday, the focus was on defining the problem of online hate, media misrepresentation, and systemic racism. And today we'll explore solutions, right, including discussions in legislation, regulation, and a number of other areas. More words on that in a few minutes. But first, I just also wanted to mention a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So today's session will be recorded. And should you not be able to stay for the entire duration of the day for whatever reason, the event recording will be made available next week. And we'll be sending out an email, which will also include a short event survey. Now, I really encourage you to please complete the questionnaire if you can, as it really is a helpful tool for us to plan and to improve future events. Closed captioning in English is available also for today's session, and you can find the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom menu bar. As well, each session today will have the Q&A function enabled. Now, this function can also be found at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom menu bar. And I'm sure, like me, that many of you will likely have questions for our speakers and experts. So I really do encourage you to take advantage of that function. Now, before we get started with today's sessions, I'd like to mention that as part of our continued research in this area, the Diversity Institute will be hosting 3 focus groups in the coming weeks, aimed at understanding experiences and perceptions of media bias. We're also interested in interviewing journalists about their experiences. Now, these sessions are scheduled for mid to late July, and our team will post the specific times and dates on the chat for everyone to see. If you're interested in participating in those focus groups, we kindly ask that you please review and complete the consent form that, again, our team is also placing in the chat. And a member of our team will contact you to help with registration. Now, yesterday we started painting the landscape regarding online hate, misrepresentations in the media, and systemic racism. And the panelists really identified a number of different patterns, characteristics, dynamics, and impact of the organization and mobilization of groups and individuals, in some cases, promoting those extreme right-wing, racist, misogynistic, anti-Muslim, anti-2S LGBTQ+, and xenophobic ideologies and violences. For example, we discussed the connections of these spaces and discourses with state institutions, including the coercive institutions of the state. We also touched on, for example, the deployment of technology-facilitated gender and sexual-based violence and harassment, as well as the importance of thinking about these issues, both in historical and intersectional terms. Inevitably, yesterday, some panelists also touched on some potential solutions, or at least some promising avenues for change. And these, for those that were here yesterday, you may remember, ranged from the individual on how to engage with hate speech and harassment online, to those that are anchored in civil society and collective action, building on solidarity and allyship, to those avenues that really engage more directly with the state and with law. So for those of you who were here yesterday, you remember that these potential solutions were also often rife with their own challenges, and that we needed to take into account if we were to ensure that they were really successful. But those points really provided a very good bridge for today's discussion, when we'll be focusing more on the potential solutions in different spheres. So let me stop here and turn to our first panel of the day. And today's first panel will be discussing how to deal with hate on the internet. And to help moderate this session, I invite our panel chair, Susie Dunn, who's an assistant professor at Dalhousie's Schulich School of Law, to turn on her camera and to start things off. Susie, over to you.
Great. Hello. Thank you, everyone, for coming today to listen to this panel. It's such an important topic. As I'm sure all of you know from the conversations over the last few days, and anyone who just exists in our modern world, we've seen such an increase in the rise in racist hate speech on the internet. And you see all these layers of intersections that show up when it comes to hate against LGBTQ people, misogyny on the internet, and all of these things layer together. So I'm really looking forward to having a discussion today with our 3 panelists about some of the solutions that they might think are helpful, or addressing where there are gaps that might be able to be filled in. So some of the conversation we're going to have today is looking a bit at what's the role of government, both in regulation and other government action. What's the role of tech companies in content moderation? How can public education play a role in ending hate speech online? So before we get started, I'll introduce our 3 panelists, and following that, they'll each have about 5 minutes to talk a bit about the research that they're doing in this area, And then we'll move on to a bit more of a guided discussion, a bit of a fireside chats. And following that, we will open up to a Q&A. But as you're listening to the conversation, if there's something that piques your interest or you have a question, pop it into the Q&A so that you don't forget it by the time that we get down to the Q&A, and we'll welcome those at the end of the session. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ahmed El-Rawi. He is an associate professor of news, social media, and public communication at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, and he woke up very early to come join our conversation today. He's also the founder of the Disinformation Project. His research interests are related to news, global communication, and social media with an emphasis on Canada and the Middle East. Dr. El-Rawi is also a founding member of the Digital and Media and Digital Literacy Academy in Beirut. His new research project, which is funded by a SSHRC Insight grant, investigates the issues of racism and democracy from the perspective of racialized Canadian journalists, the online public, and news content, partly to understand whether racism negatively influences democracy. And I'll introduce all three of our panelists, and then we'll circle back to our commentary. So next we have Anatoly Grudz. And Dr. Grudz is a professor of information technology management, and he holds the Canada Research Chair in Privacy Preserving Digital Technologies at the Ted Rogers School of Management at the Toronto Metropolitan University. He's also the Director of Research of the Social Media Lab at the university and is a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. His researcher as a computational social scientist focuses on studying the impact of social media platforms on communication, collaboration, information dissemination, and the formulation of communities online, and how these changes affect society. And finally, we have Dr. Karim Bardisi. And Dr. Bardisi is a public service leader who has worked for a better democracy, a more educated and engaged population, and better public policy throughout his professional career. He is the executive director of DIAS, which is a public policy and leadership institute at the Toronto Metropolitan University. In 2017, he co-founded the Leadership Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University and took on additional responsibilities as the executive director of the Brookfield Institute in January 2023. Karim also co-teaches Making the Future, for which he has won 2 teaching awards from TMU's Faculty of Arts. He has worked as a journalist, as a politics and policy columnist for the Toronto Star, an editorial writer and a business reporter for the Globe and Mail, and as an editor assistant at Slate Magazine. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with all three of you today. But why don't we get started with Dr. Grudz? Why don't you take 5 minutes and tell us a bit about your thoughts on this topic and research you've done in relation to it?
Thank you, CJ, for this introduction. It's just amazing for me to hear. We actually have panel from coast to coast, right? From Halifax, where you add, to where Ahmed's on the other coast. So this is wonderful because this area is also, well, it doesn't have borders, but it touches on so many aspects of our digital and offline lives. And so hopefully we can highlight that during this session. First, I want to show you a bit of research we're doing in this space as a way to kind of introduce my perspectives and where we're coming from, but also as a way to demonstrate how we arrive into some of the solutions that we will, potential solutions that we'll discuss, because we have to know the landscape, what's actually happening, in our case, what's happening on social media, to propose any kinds of solutions. So let me just briefly share my screen, and I'm aware I only have 5 minutes. So I'm going to go fairly fast just as a way to introduce some of the work we're doing in this space. As Suzy mentioned, I'm a computational social scientist, and what it means essentially, we're looking at a lot of large-size data sets, and in our case, data sets coming from public discourse across different social media platforms. And in this case, in this recent project, we're trying to understand narratives that shapes attitudes and stereotypes towards immigrants. So essentially looking at anti-immigrant narratives. And this particular project looks at anti-immigrant narratives on a platform that we all familiar with, Twitter, as one of the more public platforms out there that because of the prominence of certain users on this platform, it does shape kind of public discourse and attitudes on many topics, including immigrants and immigration policies. So that's why we thought it's important to put a spotlight on this platform. And specifically, we're looking at anti-immigrant narratives about Ukrainian refugees, considering Russia's full-scale invasion that started last year in February, then forced millions of Ukrainians to flee home for safety and security, largely to European Union countries. In fact, based on recent stats from UN, there were over 8 million refugees from Ukraine that are recorded across Europe. And so these are large numbers, but I want to say that personally, for me, it's not just the number. The pictures, I'm from Ukraine, and the pictures you can see on this slide actually shared by my sisters. She was fleeing the war essentially last March, crossing the border on foot into the Poland. So this case, we'll look at anti-immigrant, as I mentioned, anti-refugee narratives on social media and Twitter specifically. We're trying to understand the types of, essentially this narratives exist against the refugees and types of users, online personalities and identities that engage in these toxic exchanges in this context, both on the receiving end as well as those to instigate. And the idea is that essentially to know what, to propose a solution, we need to understand what's happening. We use our own social media analytics tools, in this case, Communalytic, the platform we've been developing over the last few years that examine different discourses on different platforms, including Twitter. And specifically, the platform allows us to analyze this discourse automatically because we're talking about millions of messages. So it's a large scale. We need to have some way to automate, to provide systematic approach to understand what's really happening. So we're using this built-in module, toxicity analysis module, based on Google's Perspective API that identifies, most toxic discourse that we can examine in more details. And in our case, because we look at immigrants, refugees, we were interested in identity attacks. So essentially toxic language that attacking someone based on their identity. It could be nationality, race, gender, sexual orientation, ideology, and so on. So it kind of helps us to pinpoint at most toxic narratives out there. So we started with a large data set of 800 million tweets that mentioned Ukraine in most common European languages, as well as the words like immigrant, refugees, asylum seekers. So it gave us a good sample. And then we narrowed down to look at only most the messages that were identified by this automated approach that exhibit identity attacks. So then we remove duplicates because we look for unique narratives. We want to describe the types of things people say about Ukrainian refugees and say it in toxic language, essentially. So we ended up with 3,000 tweets. And so we manually reviewed those tweets to identify thematic narratives, but we also look at the kind of communication patterns, who interacts with whom when they engage in these toxic exchanges, to understand who is on the receiving end and who's instigators. And just briefly to highlight that, there are multiple narratives exist. We can broadly group them into 3, and I'm sure there are more categories. But what stood out for us were those messages regarding appealing to fear. So Ukrainian refugees supposedly untrustworthy and dangerous, right? So you shouldn't welcome them in your home or in your country. Then there's a group of messages appealing to fairness. So messages would say in this category, they say, well, Ukrainian refugees get preferential treatment as opposed to other refugees or asylum seekers. And then then you have the third large category of messages, those that are really tapping into stereotypes and phobia, for example, accusing Ukrainian refugees of being racist or ungrateful. And so what this tells us essentially, so there are different narratives and potentially driven by different groups of individuals or groups. And to address this antisocial broadly described behavior, anti-refugee sentiments, you really need to develop different strategies for different types. The other side of this project, of course, examining who's getting that nasty treatment online and who is exerting that on other people. So looking at the topmost kind of attacked accounts. So what you see here is a network, communication network, where each dot here represents a Twitter account. It could be organization, could be individual. And so the larger size nodes visually shows accounts that are frequently being attacked in our data sets. And they're public accounts with thousands of followers usually. So you can clearly see like many of them politicians across different countries, actually, Ukraine, Germany, Brazil, and there are some media organizations. In this case, there are two German media outlets featured here, Bild and Welt. And so there are also journalists in this mix, just not in the top 5, but top 10, top 20. So what it tells us that people who have opinion about this topic, who are public about their opinions and have large following base, they get in those attacks. Perhaps not surprisingly, but again, understanding who's being most targeted can help us develop some of those counter strategies to protect some of these individuals who are being silenced quite often for their public statements in support of different refugee groups. Now, flipping the coin, and this is the kind of last result, I want to feature who is actually posting toxic messages, and specifically identity attack type of messages on Twitter. Here, it's the same network, so that's still Twitter users, and this size, the larger size, means they are more often attacking other individuals. But because these individuals typically have small number of followers, so those are not verified, public accounts that we can think of. So we hide the usernames. So that's why you can see username 1, 2, 3. But when we examine the content they post and their profiles, they were coming from different perspectives. Quite often, because they don't have the audience, they would try to get attention of individuals in power. And we would think of, our first impression was these are the trolls, the people who are trying to attack, propagate anti-refugee sentiments. Some of them were, but other actually were trying to criticize that governments, Western governments particularly, not doing enough to support refugees and immigrants. Some were questioning the stereotypical views of refugees as either good or bad. And so essentially, the kind of main conclusion here was that you can't just look at the language somebody uses online to say that their account should be blocked or shadow ban just because of some of the toxic words they use, because sometimes they use this language to speak to the power, to actually combat, to counter racist and sexist remarks. So this is one of the main conclusions that came out of it. But the other ones I mentioned earlier, essentially just mapping out the landscape of the type of narratives against this group in particular, help us also try to think about strategies. How would you address when somebody trying to fearmonger you because, saying refugees from certain groups are bad, they're dangerous, versus somebody saying that, our government is spending too much on them. So those are different arguments that needs to be approached differently. There are also a lot of geopolitics play into these type of discussions. Each case is unique. Each platform is unique. So now that, for example, we actually see many accounts from Germany that exhibiting this type of behavior that we want to investigate further. I'll stop here, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. So what can we do about presence of this type of discourse, and is it a danger to our democracy? So thank you.
Great, thank you so much for starting off our conversation today. Next, we'll move over to Dr. Bardisi, if you'd like to join in for the next 5 minutes or so.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you, Anatoly and Ahmed. And thanks to the Diversity Institute and the team for putting this on. I'm going to try to share my screen because I've got a few slides as well. Is that okay to start with?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead. Yeah.
Let's see if this is working okay. Here we go. So at the DAIS, we're a policy and leadership think tank focused on a more inclusive and innovative economy and democracy for Canada. And as part of that work, we've been spending time for the last few years on broadly in the area of responsible technology policy, focused on Canada, and on what I'll be sharing is the fourth tranche in an annual survey that we've been doing of approximately 2,000 Canadians on various aspects of technology and responsible technology and social media regulation in Canada. and platform regulation in Canada more generally, and sharing some public opinion evidence. And it's really feeling fortunate to follow off Anatoly's presentation and the great tools that the Social Media Lab has to look at part of this phenomenon. And I'm going to share a public opinion and policy perspective on the and just share more generally how Canadians who were already hungry for a pretty interventionist approach have become even more so in the last few years. And I apologize for the neighbors sawing away there in the background if you hear that. So this is the fourth year we've done this survey, repeatable survey. This one was done in late October 2022. And just first of all, a reminder about the scope of the issue we're talking about and the penetration of main social media platforms for news content. So this is a self-reported news consumption through the platforms, and note the growth in YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, and the daily usage of those platforms for news in particular. Next thing to note is this is and I think this is maybe a version of this is maybe a more 30,000-foot version of what Anatoly is presenting. For many Canadians, the experience of online harmful content is not an issue, and you'll see there on the blue bars are those who can identify various forms of harmful content here. And going to the next slide, you're seeing a bit more detail about who's being targeted with online hate speech. And this is the question here is, have you been targeted with online hate speech that deliberately promotes hatred against a group you identify with in your travels in online spaces? So the overall result was around 10% in our latest survey, but you can see some of the categories there, up to 30% when it comes to LGBTQ 2S+ Canadians and other racialized groups definitely experiencing this. The next slide, I'll just share that this is significant enough so this is not incidental, this is not passing, and Anatoly shared versions of how that can be feeling, how this can lead to feelings of unsafety. And so obviously some evidence here of those. This is a population-wide measure, so these are concerning findings for Canadians, for policymakers, that we have this level of sense of online harm that is leading people to fear for safety or having to go to the police, which we know from the policy perspective, and we know from an implementation perspective. Police services are not, in general, the right places and not well equipped to handle most issues related to online hate. The other piece of context we have here, and this informs the policy opinions of Canadians, is really the low and declining trust in social media platforms. I think something that both Anatoly and Ahmed would know well from their own research and from and the political reaction, frankly, that you're seeing in a number of countries, that there's a political space, there's a policy space for quite aggressive policies in relation to the platforms because of the mistrust in these platforms to act as we ask, in the best interests of the public. And in fact, next slide, the trust is declining. So we were able to repeat these questions again. This is opinion survey research, but very low trust levels shown in three of the major platforms that are seen as vectors for online misinformation and hate. Just pause on the next slide and then sort of wrap up the presentation. And I think it's a really important thing to note that people are pretty aware of where the content is coming from at a very high level. So the people who use the online platforms are Canadians, at least have some perspective that it's people playing into the online platform space who have a significant role in contributing to the problem of harmful content. I'm not highlighting here the questions here about understanding of how the platforms work. We have asked questions about that in the past. There is increasing sophistication amongst Canadians in understanding how their feeds are curated, that there are algorithms involved, that this is often happening behind the scenes, but there's still not enough literacy around that. And Canadians believe that the people who are responsible for the content being harmful are the people who use the platforms. But as you can see, the second bar, who is the online platforms themselves, by a factor of more than 3 to 1 compared to the users of the platforms, are seen as the ones who have the responsibility to fix this problem. And so that leads to the next, and not as much sense that, in fact, governments can do this on their own, can do the fixing on their own. And so this notion of self-regulation or government regulation by itself is really secondary to what our survey research shows, which is that this is something that government must direct online platforms to act on. And I'll just maybe flip to the last couple slides and then end on another slide. And you can see I've just got, and we'll share this in whatever methods Juan and Diversity Institute would prefer, but on a range of potential tools, especially any takedown tools, requirements of the use of takedown tools are strongly supported by Canadians. And here's just a sense of the kinds of tools that Canadians believe platforms should be required to use. Just end with a question here that we're positioning against where policymakers need to know Canadians are at and where the platforms need to know the Canadians are at. We put a number of paired questions here that sort of puts freedom of expression perspectives on and non-interventionist expression perspectives in one hand and interventionist perspectives on the other. And as you can see, generally by a 2 to 1 ratio, Canadians more broadly would prefer the choice of a more interventionist approach. Now, whether that really results in the long-awaited online harms legislation being tabled by the Canadian government in the fall is another question. But that's the public opinion context into which this issue is being perceived in Canada at a high level.
Great, thank you for that. If you want to take down your slides when you've got a second, we'll move on to our final speaker, Dr. Al-Rawi, if you'd like to take a few minutes to share with us some of your research and thoughts on this topic.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you, Susie. Before I start, I just would like to acknowledge that I live here in Burnaby in BC, where I work as well, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Diversity Institute for inviting me for this session. It's a really important session. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. Then I would also like to acknowledge the funding I got from SSHRC. There is a lot of acknowledgement, but it's important, I think. SSHRC, the Department of Heritage, and the BC Commission for Human Rights for funding my research. And finally, acknowledge the great and wonderful research teams I've been working with. And without them, I wouldn't have been able to do anything, actually. That's for the acknowledgement. I don't have, in fact, any slides, so I apologize for that. I thought it's just like a general introduction. I run the Disinformation Project, which has been there since 2019. And in the beginning, I'm talking, of course, in the beginning about misinformation and disinformation, because there is an overlap with online hate. When I explored this project, I thought I just start with the journalists and how they view the issue of reporting on misinformation. But then I thought maybe it's important to expand, and then we looked elsewhere within the Canadian context. So we explored, for example, the way misinformation has been weaponized by politicians from all sides, not only from the right, but also from the left, which is very important to mention in Canada, because I think there is some kind of bias in the way many people look at that issue, because politicians are not immune from spreading misinformation. For many reasons, it could be because of ignorance as well. The second area we looked at was foreign interference, and we specifically used social media content, and that content was targeting Canadians from Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Russia. And all of this is part of a forthcoming book. Hopefully, will be published within a year. And then we looked at the oil and gas sector and how they weaponize misinformation, including the vaping industry. It's a huge thing in Canada, usually not discussed, but it's ongoing and it's very concerning. And of course, COVID happened, so all of that changed. But I will stop here with misinformation because it's a complicated thing. I'll move on to the new research I'm doing about mediated racism. Again, I got funding from SSHRC, and I thought maybe I would like to see how racialized Canadian journalists view this issue, and specifically looking at one question, and one question alone. It is a theoretical one. Does the experience of racism negatively impact democratic engagement? That's my question. I mean, I know you can simply say, yes, of course, but prove it, and that's my point. And then I moved on to the second thorny issue, which is trending these days. It's critical race theory. Critical race theory, as you know, has been weaponized, and now it's becoming, actually, it should be a whole book about it, because a lot of politicians in the South, and here, of course, are talking about it as problematic. But I wanted to add one more word to that theory, which is empirical critical race theory, which is simply the way that we can prove there is systemic racism here in Canada. So that's my new project, and I'm working now with about 7 great researchers exploring this issue from different perspectives. So we finished interviewing about 12 racialized Canadian journalists to see how they view this issue and their role in this. All of them agree there is a lot of systemic racism still ongoing in the news industry. Now, this is another important thing. And I think Anatoly mentioned this about Ukrainians. You know, when we talk about racialized people, it's definitely an intersectional issue. We cannot just put all of those racialized groups together. There are so many different differences in the way they experience Canada in general, especially when it comes to immigrants. If you're an immigrant from the UK, your experience will be definitely different if you are white than someone, for instance, black, or someone veiled, and so on. What I have found was that people were talking about totally different experiences, because that's important. We've got to look at the intersectional issue, especially when it comes to issue of diversity. And even if some people are diverse, it doesn't mean that they are really into the issue of equality. And that's another point I need to mention. 2 more things, then I expanded the project and started interviewing racialized Canadian politicians. So now we are done with about 8 of them, federal as well as provincial politicians. And what I found was very interesting insight that they have offered. And finally, and that's probably interesting, we examined the parliament speeches referencing the word racism since 1900 until today. Interestingly, in Canada, the majority of the discussion, when we did some kind of digital analysis, most of the discussion is centered around the South, Donald Trump and the United States, as if it's like what I call cultural amnesia, as if there is nothing going on here. It's, again, some kind of double standards when we look at systemic racism in this country, because it's just like, well, it's happening there and we are so good. Totally false, totally wrong. And that's something I'm very much interested in writing about and publishing, hopefully, a book by the end of this project. Sorry if I've taken so long, but this is what I've been working on during the past few years. Thank you.
Great, thank you. No, that was wonderful. That gives us a lot to speak about. I've been thinking as I've been listening to all of you, and part of this conversation specifically in this panel is around solutions. You know, like, what can we do about it? And I'm going to start off the first question asking about government and regulation. And I think it's one of the more common questions to be asked. But before I do ask the 3 of you what your thoughts are on what you think the role of government is, both in creating regulation policy and other supports for people to end online hate. I also want to emphasize that in reality, what we know is that law is often the last place that people go to solve their problems. Like typically what we see is people are looking for technical solutions, they're looking for civil society supports, they're looking for other supports, but government does play a really important role in making statements about which harms are worthwhile of state intervention and do play an important role. So Karim, I'll start with you. What do you think the role of government should be in regulating online hates? And when thinking about this question within Canada specifically, but also, do you think there are any other jurisdictions that are doing it well?
Sorry, I might be zooming. Okay, here I am. I heard the question. Sorry if I'm choppy a bit there. It's a great question. I just typed into the chat that regulation is maybe the beginning, but not the end of this of the kinds of moves we need to make in this policy space. In our advocacy, because underneath the Reach, we do have a number of advocacy perspectives that we bring to government on this. We're pretty supportive of the way the government had articulated the 5 categories of harm that could be done, and this idea that we needed some sort of institution that sat outside of government that was working with the platforms to assist them with the implementation of whatever provisions are going to be in legislation. We think that, well, the experience in Germany in particular of very aggressive takedown notice provisions with very large fines. Some of the things that governments attempt to do are, when they legislate, are technically too difficult, and the technology moves too fast. So we kind of, in general, at the dais, and I think in conversation with some of our colleagues, including some here, prefer systems level and principles level approaches that give some flexibility to the platforms. So that's one overall policy perspective. The other overall policy perspective is platform regulation itself is not enough. We have in Canada anyway, we have a civic media policy in which civic media is funded through various means, and now a requirement under Bill C-18 for platforms to make payments to publishers, and the associated choices that have just been made by Meta and Facebook to pull that content from Canada. So we need a really robust set of investments in civic journalism of the kind that can play a role. The other thing I'll maybe point to, which is beyond the scope of most legislative proposals, and I think there's a couple places that are experimenting with this in Europe, is this idea of algorithmic transparency and the ability for people to, policymakers to get into the black box with the companies. That is quite an extreme measure, given the IP protections that are expected by these companies as they're developing these very powerful, very potentially profitable products. But I think it's a frontier that we may need to approach, where there's some involvement in the consideration of how these algorithms are working to do the kinds of things that to lift up the kinds of things that Anatoly and Ahmed so persuasively show are pretty rampant.
Great, thank you for that. Ahmed or Anatoly, do you have anything additional that you'd like to add to the question around regulation? Anatoly, I see you nodding. Should I let you in? Oh, no, Ahmed's got his hand up. You can go first.
And Shirley, please go ahead.
I can follow, please.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, again, I agree with Karim about this. What I've found to be interesting is Bill C-18. Now, we've just been talking about it, and it clearly shows the lack of power of the Canadian government in implementing certain bills and regulations. It's actually these big tech companies seem to be more in power, unfortunately. The Canadian government's influence might not be as large as that of the US government, unfortunately. So that's why I think this kind of regulations should come from the social media sites themselves as well. We've got to pressure them, and this kind of responsibility is a shared one. It's not only the government doing this, but also academics need to remind and write critically write about these social media sites, journalists as well. So it's a shared responsibility, and they can do a lot of things in limiting the amount of hate available on these platforms. In other words, it's a shared work, and this also includes NGOs as well. And in the end, of course, the social media sites own their own platforms, and they need to take feedback from these different actors in order to improve what is happening. Thank you.
Just to echo my colleagues on the panel, there's limit to what regulations can do. And Susie, I think you mentioned, and Fleur mentioned, as soon as regulations is out, it's outdated in the technology space. So, you may develop regulations to tell what Meta or Twitter should do in terms of certain requests, takedown requests. But then we'll look at new technology, let's say based on blockchains, where the platforms are decentralized. There's no single entity control the content. So who are you going to send, takedown request to? So there's no single authority on that. That's the definition of a decentralized platform. What we've seen in our work in the space, what most effective approach would be is to empower journalists and academics, similar to what Ahmed was commenting on, because these are the category of professionals who put a spotlight on some of the most dangerous online harassment trends, coordinated attack, the spread of misinformation. And from my experience, once researchers and journalists put a spotlight on especially large campaigns that platform may or may not be aware of, once it's in the public domain, the platforms feel a bit more pressured and to do something about it, to take down. There are many cases where some of the accounts were taken down because they were reported in the media or by researchers. The problem, though, here, we see the quite opposite. The platform are shutting down their APIs, the automated means to collect and analyze data, publicly available data by researchers and journalists. Those APIs are shutting down, or they put in a huge price tag that the public sector cannot afford. So diminish the transparency and accessibility of that type of data. We also see some, when you have researchers, let's say in NYU, trying to study how Meta is serving ads, like who's using targeted ads to target whom, and they put in together their own tools, developing research tools, and then they're being sued for that by the platforms. That's also problematic. So I think if we're talking about regulations and policy in this space, any regulations that will add transparency and accountability, so empower, especially in empowering and safeguarding research, academic research, and journalistic practices in space, that's the way to go. So in EU, for example, there are discussions around the implementation of Digital Service Act, which will allow public interest groups and researchers to have some access from platforms in this space of antisocial behavior, misinformation, but they still they're at the stage of implementation, but we're not even at the stage of policy making in this space. So we're a little bit behind on that front.
Yeah, Anatoly, I think you bring up a really interesting point. I think two of the things that you brought up are really interesting, is this capacity for organizations and journalists who are aware of online hate to bring attention to it in a way that social media takes it seriously and also is able to escalate takedowns when there's real misinformation and real harmful information out there. I was just at RightsCon a few weeks ago, and we were having conversations with folks like Access Now, who have the digital security helpline, where activists can call and escalate these types of issues. And then on the flip side, there's organizations that are creating technologies that are helpful for managing hate. And I'm not sure if this is the proper name for the organization, but I believe it's called Block Hate, and they were working with Twitter so that you could they were using an API on Twitter to really organize what you would see on your site. But now they're being charged a large amount of money in order to have their service on the platform. And so it's restricting people's ability to use these services that help protect them from experiencing a lot of online hates. But Anatoly, I think I'll turn back to you, because I think outside of regulation, often what we're looking for are technical solutions, that either platforms could implement themselves, that people could use on their site. So do you have any examples of either existing technical solutions or content moderation practices that are actually helpful in addressing online hate, or examples of things that possibly could be useful or created that you've seen in some of your research?
Oh, definitely, and I'll mention a couple things we see in this space that think it's effective, and I also look forward to what my colleagues in this panel will say from their experiences. So first of all, when we look at the reports from major platforms like Meta, what they do about it, they will report how many online harassment type of messages, hate speech messages they remove. So they like to report that because those are large numbers, but of course it could be in millions, but then you have billions of messages. So it sounds a lot, but it doesn't really necessarily get to doesn't tell us whether it's effective. And also the problem is with this number, they're small numbers sometimes. The percentages of truly online harassment, bullying type of messages, they're usually 3 to 5%. And so that can diminish, it may sound not a lot, but actually when a person receiving those messages, they're impacted a lot personally, professionally. So Karim's work shows that as well from the survey you presented it. So I think it's a dangerous kind of slippery slope just to look at the millions of messages Meta or other platforms removing, because of the bullying and harassment versus what people actually experiencing in a supposedly small percentages. So we have to be cautious about that regard. Not to say that platforms shouldn't continue being proactive, but it's not just the only approach they should take in terms of just removing the content. Also, even with all of the automated techniques to detect harassing and bullying messages, to remove them potentially or flag them, they still, even Facebook, Meta, relying about 30% of their messages they take action on are still reported by users. So it feels like there's honor on, it's an onerous process on users to report those messages. And then when the users report it, it's like a black box. Usually you may wait for months and months to get a response that something wasn't actually taken care, they didn't take any actions on it. So because of lack of transparency on this reporting process, I think it undermines its effectiveness. Platforms will tell you, we don't want to disclose, how many reports that you need to receive, but that's not the point. Right. The point is that if you're a user, you exposed to something that is harmful or you perceive to be harmful, you need to have a clear roadmap, what's happening when you report it. And sometimes it's just the matter that platforms don't hire enough content moderators. It's a very difficult job. We've read about the health danger of these type of professionals, and they don't hire enough. And a lot of colleagues on the research side that work at big social media platforms in this trust and safety departments, they are also being fired, sadly, over the last year. So this is kind of a dangerous trend we're observing. So the solution would be, yes, hire more staff to improve compliance, make this process more streamlined. But those are kind of wishful thinking. I would love to see if there are more tangible solutions or ways to kind of enforce that on the platform level. Karim, over to you. I see your hand, and then Ahmed.
Yes, Susie, can I just do a quick follow on that?
Oh yeah, I love that Anatoly's just moderating for me. Really.
No, it's a great point, and it's something we haven't really talked about in this panel, and I don't want to get too abstract about it, but it's a business model that prioritizes exponential growth, and with exponential growth of problems, and they're trying to solve them geometrically or arithmetically, and so you see the hiring of thousands of content moderators in Philippines, and it's an economic growth strategy in part for some of these countries, or partnerships with companies like Accenture and others. But the online harm phenomenon globally is related to the profits that are available the high margins that are available for these. It's part of the cost of doing business, and we're seeing at the global and regional scale that massive fines, that various forms of legal sanction, that the social license that's gained by maybe hiring some content moderation humans in large numbers. Those things, on the one hand, don't address the problem, and the other hand, don't seem to sufficiently scoop from the oligopoly level, monopoly level profits that are earned at the very highest level by some of these platforms. So that's maybe just a business model comment that that requires, and maybe again, when we think of the breadth of tools that are required here, there are maybe some larger issues. I just wanted to point that out because the point around technical solutions and then using humans to amplify the technical solutions is an important one. And again, the broader piece here is we have a market economy that's promoting the development of these kinds of companies. And I would say a growth of these companies that's beyond the human's comprehension to run them. And perhaps we saw a heroic attempt to save one company, Twitter, that did not have the result that was intended by the heroic saving of that company. Sorry, went too long there.
Oh, that's great. Ahmed, please join in.
Thank you, Susie. Technical aspects are very important. Before I mention a few things, I would like to just say something about the insight I got from interviewing one racialized Canadian journalist. They told me that if you block someone on Twitter, they might become more agitated and more motivated to spread hate. So their technique was to mute them. And I think that was very smart. Mute them means on Twitter, you as a user, you will not see what they post, and they will not be blocked. So when they search for you, they will not get the message saying you are blocked. Instead, they would think they are still, able to send their messages. The point I'm making here is that social media companies can take certain measures in order to, for example, demonetize bad actors, delisting other users' feeds. That's another technique. Slowing the content of the bad actors, downranking them, if you're talking about Reddit, blocking certain hashtags that could be problematic, like QAnon. If you go to Instagram, for instance, the QAnon hashtag is not allowed. The same with fentanyl. So that could be another technique. Yet on Twitter, these kinds of hashtags are allowed. So that could be another technique used. And of course, flagging content, something that Anatoly mentioned. In other words, we need to be smarter when it comes to how to tackle online hate. Because again, if you block those people and deplatform them, they will simply go elsewhere to Gab, Parler, BitChute, they go to Rumble, and that's where they keep on spreading their hate. So there must be another smarter way of dealing with this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. So thinking about that, we've talked a bit about technical solutions, we've talked a bit about regulation, but how do you think the role of public education or media plays into tackling online hate? And Karim, maybe we'll turn to you first for that question.
Well, I'm curious. There's a really interesting. I want a group to hear a bit more about RightsCon and Costa Rica, because I think it starts in places like that. It starts with the people on the frontiers of research and the frontiers of civil society, building and equipping the tools. When I worked as a journalist, we were really looking for those vectors, those places that could pipeline knowledge about this space into a more mainstream media system. So that's maybe just one way of answering the question, is that and maybe serving up an opportunity for you to say whatever you want about RightsCon. But I think there are great opportunities, and not generally taken advantages of opportunities to have mainstream media, which are under-resourced but really interested in these issues, and are often the most resourced ones can be patient to build out their knowledge and their expertise in this space. You look at the Globe and Mail's Access to Information Project and the tools they've built there. There are other kinds of tools that the best and biggest news organizations can work with that are pulling on this research, that are pulling on the insights that Ahmed has been referring to. And I think there's just a great opportunity for that mainstream media, who are very interested in doing this kind of partnership to get some of these insights into the hands of their audiences, which are going to be necessarily broader than the audiences that any of the four of us would have access to. I don't know if that helped answer your question, but.
No, that does help. And I think you're right that there's something interesting about spaces like RightsCon, where we can get a lot of people together who are all thinking creatively on these issues, because in those spaces you have academics, you have activists, you have media. A few of the sessions that I was at, you had folks from content and trust and safety from organizations. And I think having those spaces where people can come and gather. And of course, there's always challenges as we see every year on who has access to those spaces when it comes to finances, when it comes to visa, when it comes to all of those things. But I think having those public education spaces are really important. And Ahmed, maybe I'll turn to you, because you've worked a lot with journalists, both on experiencing online hate, but also talking about online hate. Like, where do you think the role of education and media comes into play in turning the tide on online hate?
Of course, it's integral. And I think when it comes to combating online hate, we've got to look at it from different levels. So first, there is the psychological. So you've got to work on yourself. And this happens with developing critical media literacies, but also with training. So there is in cognitive science, and I worked with some cognitive scientists from different places, there is this concept called pre-bunking, which is a concept based on vaccination. So you inoculate yourself against bad information by training yourself repeatedly, that when you are exposed to bad information, you know what it is and how to deal with it. The best thing I can mention here is spamming. We get a lot of spammers by email, by text, and by sometimes phone calls. And so we need to be more literate about how to deal with that. Otherwise, we will lose money. Like, we will be scammed sometimes. And this can only happen through some kind of training. So there's this psychological level, but there is also education when it comes to the community level. And here there are so many sides involved. Schools need to be better equipped in providing this kind of education. We don't have this in Canada, unfortunately. We see in Finland, for instance, they are much more ahead of us. There is no funding for this, maybe because the government doesn't find it to be important, despite the fact that misinformation simply kills. And we've seen this in COVID-19 and the issue of vaccination. If you don't believe in its efficacy, you can simply die. There is a larger likelihood that you can die. So misinformation kills, as simple as that. We need more of that. And we need also to give more funding for NGOs and your institute, other NGOs, fact-checking organizations. In Canada, again, we don't have that. Most of the fact checkers are the famous ones are based in the US. Like, that's why I keep on talking about the importance of establishing a non-partisan, independent fact-checking institution made up of a diverse array of scientists, experts in different fields, so that we will have some kind of consensus about issues like climate change. And mind you, I'm very careful in what I'm saying, a wide array of experts. So when it comes to climate change science, we've got to bring in different groups, different people with different expertise on climate change. We cannot just bring one cluster. Otherwise, the fact checkers will not be right. So there are, as I said, different levels and when it comes to this. Thank you.
And Anatoly, as you were going through your presentation, I was thinking you've got such rich data, right? You've got such rich data that tells such an interesting story. But one of the challenges that comes to getting that data out there is translation, because you want to get it to an academic audience, you want to get it to policymaker audience, you want to get it to the broader audience. So in your work, what are some of the practices that you have in translating that data to get it into spaces where people can access it at the proper level that they need?
I guess one of the most effective ways we found in the social media lab to translate research into more public domains will be op-eds. So in Canada, around the world, we have the Conversation outlet where an academic writes in a plain language that is accessible to the broader audience about their research. And so, of course, the conversation is being managed by journalists who can help to edit your piece. So I think that's one of the most impactful ways we found to interact with the general public. Through interviews, of course, it's important to have inform the journalists. And you also feel sometimes when journalists approach you for a story to comment on a story related to the topic we're discussing today, and they just need a quote, like you get a sense of it. So you already expecting it's not going to be an informative piece, but in many cases, you have journalists who are quite informed about the complexity of platform regulations, platform governance, and they really engage with you in a conversation, and then they're able to translate to their audiences. So I think tapping into what Ahmed said, offering programs to support professional journalistic practices across our communities in Canada, I think it's quite important. It is unfortunate that a lot of Ahmed, you mentioned fact-checking initiatives coming from the US. We don't have a lot of homegrown opportunities like this. At least that's how it fits.
Great, thank you. So we only have 1 minute left. I was about to ask a really hard question from the Q&A, but I actually think we probably don't have time for it. Why don't we use our last minute for each of you to take 30 seconds or so to just add a final comment, and then we'll close off the session. Ahmed, would you like to start off? Thank you.
So as just one question I would like to ask everyone, I mean, just something for them to reflect. It's simple. Does incivility enhance democratic engagement? In other words, does online hate make you more pissed to the extent where you become more involved in politics and democracy? That's the only thing I would like everyone to reflect on. Thank you.
That's a great thought to leave on. Kareem, I saw you've turned your mic off. Do you want to go next?
Oh, well, I was just going to maybe respond to that. And it's something sometimes we who spend a lot of time in this conversation rail against the lack of trust. But actually, maybe this is a bit of what Ahmed is getting at. Strong democracies have the right level of mistrust. You don't want to, you need to have some level of mistrust, which creates the tension in the system. The question is that mistrust targeted against certain groups, or is it targeted at the power that is governing the institution? And I think strong democracies have strong, even multicultural democracies have coherence within the population and are maybe pointing any mistrust at the governing institutions themselves. Sorry if that's too theoretical, but just wanted to pick up on that point.
It's helpful. Anatoly, you're going to finish us off with a final comment.
I just want to reiterate, there are lots of things platform can do, and they missed a lot of opportunities to do so, to protect Canadians from online harm. There are lots of talks empowering individuals. I'm all for it. Educational programming, even with youth, important to remind them that, online harassment, cyberbullying is not okay in whatever form and shape. But I also want to emphasize the point that we need to empower the stakeholders in our society that have already shown quite effective in terms of combating some of the coordinated harassment campaigns and trolling campaigns against Canadian society. So those would be journalists, academics. So whether it's about protecting them from lawsuits from the platform when they're doing platform-related research, or whether then in form of mandate for platforms to offer access to some of the publicly available data that can increase transparency and accountability. I think in whatever forms, I think we need to advocate for that type of access.
Great, thanks so much. And I really appreciate that last comment, especially thinking about the ways that, really this is about norm setting, and talking to people about changing their norms in general and how they behave online. the internet is relatively new and we're still learning what appropriate behavior looks like. And so as much as we create regulations, a lot of this is learning to adjust our behaviors. But thank you so much to our panelists for taking time out of your busy day for this great conversation. And I look forward to the rest of the conversation throughout the day. And I'll pass it back, I believe, to the Diversity Institute, or do we just sign off?
Yes. Thank you, Susie. Thank you very much. And a very big thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Anatoly, Karim, and Ahmed, for the very, very interesting discussion. Just some really, as we start putting together our painting for the day, if you will, just some really key points about, for example, the power of technology to diagnose the problem more precisely and in a more nuanced way, but also the complexities of finding the best technological solutions to address that problem. I think something that all panelists sort of like recognized and talked about. Also, the fact of that fertile ground, if you will, for a more interventionist, be it legislative or policy change regarding the regulation and control of online platforms. The devil is, of course, in the details of how to use those tools, as well as the limitations of those tools. But again, we heard a very rich discussion around that. And finally, just that the broader fact of how the path to solutions here really seems to be infused with power relations among the various actors involved, including government, online platforms, and civil society. It's really a very complex legal, political, and economic game as well to construct these horizontal and vertical channels of accountability. So thank you again, all of you, for this very, very stimulating conversation.